In 1954, a democratically elected government in Guatemala was overthrown. Now, this was a huge moment, a pivotal event that would cast a really long, dark shadow over Central America for decades to come. Its legacy is still being felt today. But the story of how it all went down, well, that's where things get truly shocking. I mean, it's a story that sounds almost made up, and it really hinges on this one central question. How on earth did a banana company get powerful enough to help bring down a democracy? That's the core of what we're going to unpack here. All right, so to really get this, we have to rewind the clock a little bit to the time right before the coup. From 1944 to 1954, Guatemala was in the middle of what people called its 10 years of spring. And it was exactly what it sounds like, this rare, hopeful decade of real democratic reform, social progress, a genuine feeling that things were getting better. Now, at the very heart of this whole democratic movement was a law called Decree 900. It was this really ambitious land reform law, and its goal was actually pretty simple. Take these massive chunks of land that were just sitting there, totally unused, and give them to peasant families who had no land of their own. The whole point was to create some economic independence for the people of Guatemala. And this right here, this is where the conflict really ignites. On one side, you have President Árbenz' government just trying to implement Decree 900 and build up the country's economy for its own citizens. And on the other side, the United Fruit Company, a massive American corporation, and by far the biggest landowner in all of Guatemala. So when the government took about 400,000 acres of the company's uncultivated land, UFC launched this massive PR and lobbying campaign in Washington. Their main talking point? They painted Árbenz' democratic reforms as a communist threat. So that brings us to the American response. Between the United Fruit Company's intense lobbying and the general Cold War paranoia of the time, the CIA got the green light to launch something called Operation PB Success. But here's the thing, this was not going to be a normal invasion. Not at all. It was basically a masterclass in psychological warfare. The CIA's playbook was all about deception, winning with fear instead of force. First, they set up a fake radio station, the Voice of Liberation, and started broadcasting fake news about a massive rebel army sweeping through the country. Then came the psyops. They were sending threatening letters, hangman's nooses, even little coffins to government officials to freak them out. And that massive rebel army they were talking about, it was a tiny proxy force of just 480 men trained and funded by the CIA, not to actually win a war, but just to create the illusion of one. And to top it all off, they hired American pilots to run bombing raids over the capital city just to crank up the chaos and terror. And the crazy thing is, it worked. The deception absolutely worked. The Guatemalan military, believing they were about to face the full power of the United States, basically refused to fight. And with no army to back him, President Árbenz had no choice. He was forced to resign on June 27, 1954. And just like that, the 10 years of spring came to a sudden, tragic end. So what came next? What happens when a democracy collapses like that? Well, it was swift and it was brutal. There wasn't a new election. Instead, a military dictator, basically handpicked by the United States, was installed. The new guy, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, did not waste any time. He immediately went to work undoing every single thing the democratic government had accomplished. He completely reversed the land reforms. He banned all opposition parties. And then he launched a violent campaign of arrests, torture, and executions against anyone who had supported the previous government. Now, this is maybe the most crucial point to understand in this whole story. The 1954 coup wasn't just the end of a democratic dream. It was the direct catalyst, the spark that lit the fuse for something so much worse, a devastating and incredibly brutal 36-year civil war. And you can just trace this tragic path of escalating violence over the decades. The 54 coup creates this repressive state, which then leads to the start of a civil war by 1960. Then, through the 60s, the U.S. starts counterinsurgency training for the Guatemalan military, which leads directly to the creation of death squads and the practice of disappearing people. By the 1980s, the violence hits this horrifying genocidal peak with what was called a scorched earth campaign, which systemically targeted the indigenous Maya population. The human cost of this 36-year war is it's staggering. It's estimated that over 200,000 people were either killed or forcibly disappeared. It's a number that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Years later, a United Nations commission investigated who was responsible for all of this. and their findings were crystal clear. They found that state forces and the related paramilitary groups, the very same forces armed and trained by the U.S., were responsible for a shocking 93% of all documented human rights violations. And the UN report didn't pull any punches. It stated, flat out, that U.S. aid and training had a significant bearing on human rights violations. In other words, they were directly linking American support to the military's ability to carry out these atrocities. And yet, at the time, this was the official stance from the U.S. Right in the middle of that genocidal peak of the war, President Ronald Reagan described the dictator in charge, General Rios Montt, as, quote, a man of great personal integrity, totally dedicated to democracy. The disconnect between that statement and the reality on the ground is just jarring. This story, it doesn't really end in 1996 when the peace accords were signed. The legacy of the 1954 coup is really a legacy of silence and of unresolved issues that are still shaping Guatemala and U.S. foreign policy even today. The impact has been profound, and you can still see the ripples. For the United States, it set a really dangerous precedent for this kind of covert interventionism that was repeated all over Latin America. For Guatemala, it left this deep wound of political instability, crippling social inequality that you can trace right back to those reverse land reforms, and a culture of impunity, where the people who committed these horrific crimes have largely just gotten away with it. And in the years since, the difference in how this history has been acknowledged is, well, it's pretty stark. In 2011, the Guatemalan government actually issued a formal apology to the family of President Árbenz, and they called the coup a crime. The United States, on the other hand, has declassified documents that confirm its role, but it has never issued a formal political apology for the coup or for the devastating civil war that it helped create. And that really brings us to the final thought here. When you look at the decades of violence, the instability, the injustice that all grew from this one intervention, it really forces you to ask, what is the true cost of silence? And what is owed to the memory of those 200,000 lives?